Thank you so much for the. Ooh, okay, recording in progress. So thank you so much for this really nice introduction. I felt like, oh yeah, I would really like to be that person, and maybe I am then. So that was a really nice introduction. So today I want to share a bit of my research with you, and I'm very happy so many could join. As said, I'm working in theoretical ecology, but the goal of my research is to apply it to real world problems, just as Darren said. So let's see if I can do this now as well. Start sharing, and that was not right. I try to do this. That was better. So what I wanted to talk about today is a project that is ongoing and has been ongoing for a while, and we hope to finish this in the near future and actually get it out and published. But as it in particular now, as it is an ongoing project, I would be very happy to receive feedbacks on any parts of it, of course. And we will talk about the ecosystem service deliveries in ecological networks, and what the consequences these extinctions can have on ecosystem service delivery. And this is work that is done together with Georgi Barbas, who's also at Linköping University now. He's a former postdoc of mine. Alyssa Sertwell, also a former postdoc, currently at Helsinki University as another in her second postdoc. And Ute Jakob, that is in Helmholtz Institute in Germany. But some background first. So my research interests is in ecological networks. And this picture that I put up here is one that I quite often use in my talks, because it sort of attracts your eye and looks very complex, but it also might not tell you so much. But this is one of the most best described ecological networks, or best described food webs that we have today, and it is the Weddell Sea food web from Antarctica. And as you all clearly can see, this consists of about 500 species and 16,000 interactions. And when we walk around in this, if we're going to locate species in this food web, so each of these, I just see here, I want to put on this to point. Couldn't find it here. Do you see my arrow moving around?
Yeah, I can see that.
Yeah, okay, then we stick with that. So each of these balls are species, and each of the lines going in between them are interactions. And since this is a food web, it is feeding interactions. So that means that this species feeds on that, for example, if now this line is going there, but I'm pretty sure it does. And at the highest top here, we have the top predators of this food web. So this is Antarctica. So in this case, it will be some seals, the leopard seal, for example, or the orca. And as we go down here, we go to lower trophic levels. And at the very bottom, we have the primary producers, so the plants that are providing energy to the system. So, and even if this looks very complex, it's of course not the full story. Even if this is a very well-resolved network, we of course know that it's much more species and interactions going on. But these are the ones that has been described and formed to network today. And I'm particularly interested in when we look at ecosystems in this way of a network, if we have disturbances affecting the ecosystems, as we of course know we have all the time, we have climate change going on, we have habitat destruction, we have overharvesting of species, you know, the list can be really long. But if we have a disturbance in this network, how does that affect other parts of the network? And how far can it travel, and where can it travel, and why would the disturbance travel in a certain way? And can we actually predict where a certain disturbance will have effects, or maybe larger or smaller effects? So that is my research interest. How is the network structured, and how will that affect how sensitive it is to disturbance? Can we actually distinguish between different networks, that some networks are more resilient than other ones? And I'm also interested in where a certain species is located in the network, how that affects how sensitive it is to disturbance, or maybe not always how sensitive it is by itself, but how it acts as transporting the disturbance further in the network. So just before we go into the project I wanted to talk about today, just a quick background of what we have, how we have addressed these problems in my lab. So what drives network structure, and how can we understand it better? That's the goal of our research. And why do I focus now on structure? Well, that is because structure is always also affecting the dynamics, because of course dynamics, so how strongly species are interacting, is also affecting to a large extent how disturbances are transported in the network. But the network structure will for sure always have an effect on dynamics. So therefore I wrote down network structure here. So, but just a quick look back. So for example, we have been interested in if we could describe how many dimensions are needed to fully describe an ecological network, so a complex ecological network. And we have been interested in, can we understand these dimensions in terms of traits? So with this little figure, without going into any depth to anything here, it's just showing that we have a focal species here, a dark red species, and that interacts with all species within this lighter red square here. And all those species are in a certain depth and of a certain size. And there are species here, so for example this green one, that is outside this square, so it's in the right size span for the dark red predator, but it's not staying in the right depth, it's not in the right depth span, and therefore it's outside this predator's feeding range. So what we were interested in this paper was, could we describe the full network structure by understanding these types of traits? And could we, and how many traits were actually needed to describe the full network? And we found out there that yes, we could define the number of dimensions needed, the number of traits needed. We could identify some of the most important traits. And most interestingly, we could also define that it was quite a limited number of dimensions needed to describe even very complex networks. So that is what this other little sub-figure show. The dimensionality, so number of dimensions needed to fully describe a network structure, is on the y-axis, and on the x-axis is a measure of complexity. So how many links in this case the network had. And it was a nice trend with complexity as expected. But interestingly, we could see that even the most complex networks only took 8 dimensions to fully describe. Another example of what we have been interested in is, and a little bit more recent, is looking into network motifs. So if we look at these complex networks, they can be seen as built up by different building stones called network motifs. And that is what's shown in this first picture here. So a network motif is here, it's 3 species motif. So it's any composition of 3 species interacting together. So in this first one, for example, it's a predator that has 2 preys. And in the second one here, it's a food chain, a simple food chain. And then we can have different varieties of this. But these are called building blocks of food webs. And in this exercise, we were interested to see if we could, by defining species, or if species positions within these different network motifs, if we can understand why they were in these positions based on their traits. And this is just an example figure from that. We did a PCA here, and we have 3 different motifs here. And then the points here are different traits. So in this case, if what kind of environment the species was in, if it was a benthic species, a benthic pelagic species, or a pelagic species. And as you hear, here we talk about marine systems. And yes, we could identify there the traits were important to understand which type of motifs or building blocks the species were most often accounted in. So that was just a very short background. I'm happy to talk more about that. But it's not only species interacting in food webs. We have another important actor within food webs, and that's what we have up here in this little cartoon. Humans. Humans are interacting with food webs as well. We're interacting with the environment, but also directly with many of the species. And we do this in the same time as we are interacting with the food web and affecting the food web in many ways. We are also dependent on it. But for example, here we have human activities. So different activities that the human society is acting or putting on the food webs or the ecosystems. That results in pressures on the ecosystems. And this is again a very complex figure that is hard to grasp directly or maybe see the details in. But it's obvious that many of the activities we do put on pressure on the systems. So for example, like land claim and the coastal defense and flood protection actually put on disturbance of species. And disturbance of species was, of course, it's a very broad pressure. You can see there also other pressures defined here that are a bit more detailed. And this particular figure is taken from something that's called Baltic Sea environment proceedings. And it's a couple of years old now, but where one has particularly looked at the Baltic Sea environment and what human activities that are going on in the Baltic Sea and in the shores of the Baltic Sea, and try to identify then what pressures that put on the system. But as we put pressure, as we as human society to put pressure on the system or on the ecosystem, we also rely on for our well-being on the same ecosystems via ecosystem services, for example, or via ecosystem services. And ecosystem services can be divided into several different categories. Supporting, provisioning, cultural, and regulating is something that has been up for quite a long time as a division. But supporting can be, for example, that the ecosystem provide soil, provide food for us. Provisioning is also then providing food, of course, but also like pollination, those kind of services. Regulating services like cleaning the water or store carbon. And also cultural services like recreation and educational values. And some of these we are very dependent on. So like food provisioning and pollination and coastal protection, we are really dependent on that these services are provided to us. And as I said before, then we have these pressures that are affecting the species, and the species are providing services. And this is a schematic picture from a paper that is a couple of years old, but where we can see, or where it's drawn out, that different drivers are affecting different ecosystem services, and different species are in turn connected to different ecosystem services. And also different actions that are done from the human society for protection or for other reasons are in turn also affecting both services and species. So this is a very tangled network of services and species. To put it a bit more simple, what we will look at here is to do it like this. So we have the species in the middle. Some species are affected by certain threats. All threats are not threatening all species, although some threats, of course, are. And some species are delivering certain ecosystem services. So, for example, these top species are affected by one threat and delivers one service, whereas there are other species that might deliver several services and also be affected by several threats. And in the same manner, some services might be provided by several species. But we don't only have these species then as single species. As we started out to say, they are organized in ecological network. So therefore, a threat that is opposed to one species can, via this species interaction, affect ecosystem services that are delivered by another species, so not the species that was threatened in the first place. And this is what we want to look closer at in this project. So we want to look at how these disturbances, the threats, which species they are affecting, and how the threat then are cascading in the network to finally reach an ecosystem service and maybe pose a threat to that service. We have earlier done a work on secondary extinctions in food webs. So that a secondary extinction is when one species first is affected by or going extinct, and then starts off a cascade of extinctions in turn. And this is exactly what we want to see and what we want to look at here as well. So there are two classical approaches in looking secondary extinction. One is topological approach, when you look at a network and look at and assume that all resources need to be lost before the consumer goes extinct. So you only look then at the network structure, and you only look at resources affecting consumers. The other classical approach is dynamical. So where you usually use some kind of coupled differential equation or similar method to simulate the dynamics of the complex ecological networks. This is parameter intensive and is often limited in how large networks you actually can simulate in this way. Whereas the topological approach is very simple, and there you can do this analysis for very large networks. We wanted to do some kind of middle approach to this, but we have some things that we really want to include, and that is that the different species in the network should have different a priori risk of going extinct, because that's what we see in the ecosystems as well, that all species are not equally vulnerable to different threats. Our second property we wanted to have in is that the disturbances could affect several species simultaneously, so that we could in a free way vary how many of the species this disturbance is affecting. And we also wanted to have in that the extinction risk grows with the number of resources lost. So get away from this topological approach where you need all resources to go lost before you are dead yourself as a consumer. We did this quite a number of years ago now, and looked at secondary extinctions in food web using a Bayesian network approach, because that's what we found would be a good middle ground way between this topological and the dynamical. And a Bayesian network constructs a table of conditional probabilities between all different species in the network. So here we have a little toy network that consists of two resources, A and B, and one consumer, C. In a Bayesian network, in this method, all species are giving an a priori probability of going extinct. And we say here that value is pi. So it shouldn't be pi of I here, so it should be pi of C. But anyway, so pi is the baseline probability of going extinct. And that could be for some reason that you are more affected. You have a higher risk from the beginning without taking any of your interacting partners into account. Then the probability of extinction of the species of the consumer C here depends on the probability of the presence and absence of its resources. So a table of conditional probabilities would include all these four numbers here. So first, you have the probability that C goes extinct given that A and B are still present. And that's our baseline probability pi. Second, we have the probability that C goes extinct given that A is extinct but B is still present. And that is one value. And next, the probability that C goes extinct given that B is still present, A is still present, but B is extinct. And finally, the probability that C goes extinct if both A and B are lost. So this you can formulate for slightly larger networks as well, or for very large networks. Here is just a little comparison with this topological approach that I mentioned, where we assume, in the topological approach, one assumes that all resources have to be lost before the consumer goes lost. So if we just focus here, for example, on species D up here, then we see in the conditional probability table for D, it has a baseline probability of 0.2, so a 20% chance here of going extinct, given that the network is intact. But that probability is the same even if one of its resources, A or C, goes extinct, because it's only required that it will only be affected when all species go extinct, all its resources go extinct, and then it will go extinct with probability 1. If we instead look at the Bayesian network, for the same species and the same network, we have the same baseline probability of extinction, but it increases given when its resources are lost. So when one of A or C is lost, we have a higher risk of extinction than we have in a topological case. And then we have the same again, that if both its resources is lost, then it will go extinct itself. D will go extinct itself with a probability of 1. And the formula for this is written down here. So that was one of our goals, to have that it should depend on the baseline probability of extinction, but also be dependent on the number of preys. And we want to look at different functional forms of how extinction can occur. So here are 4 different functional forms. If you look at the linear case, or we can first look at the topological case here. In this figure, we have the fraction of resources extinct on the x-axis and the probability of the consumer going extinct on the y-axis. So in the topological case that we talked about first, we have the baseline probability of pi going extinct, and that the probability of the consumer going extinct stays on that level until all its resources are lost. So the fraction is 1. Then it increases to a probability of 1 going extinct. The linear case, yes, it's like it sounds, it increases linearly. But then we can use the beta function to basically model any function we want. So in this third case here, we see that quite few species, quite few resources needs to be lost before the consumer actually gets a quite high probability of going extinct. And in the fourth case, we have the opposite, that the consumer is quite resilient and can take quite many of its resources going extinct before it increases its probability of extinction itself. So this is how we model different resources can go extinct, or how the consumer is affected by different resources going extinct. So what we do in this Bayesian network approach, and I know it's getting maybe a little bit heavy here, but it's just to give you a background to when we then go into the ecosystem services. So what we do when we solve this Bayesian network is that we first produce a table for each and every species in the full network, specifying the probability of extinction given the states of its resources. And that is when we construct the Bayesian network. Then we compute the probability of extinction for a certain species and take all other species probabilities into account. So we look at these probability tables or condition probability tables, and we then solve the Bayesian network. And this can be done in an exact way, or it can be done by numerical simulations. I think I skipped that now. So what we did in our first paper was that we wanted to test how well this method actually worked. And we compared this Bayesian network method by simulating population dynamics using the dynamical ATN model. And for those of you who are not familiar with the ATN model, that is a quite complex dynamical model that is built up by a couple differential equations and builds on how species body size relationships are affecting how much they are affecting each other. So it's a couple differential equations. Each species has one equation, and you simulate then the changes over time. We did this for networks consisting of, now I hardly remember, but about 50 species. And we did this we simulated using the ATN model, and we did our calculation with the Bayesian Network approach. So we calculated the likelihood of exactly replicating the results from the ATN model using our Bayesian Network approach instead. And this is the calculations of the likelihood, and we don't have to go into it, but that's so we want to replicate that ATN model that is much more complex and much more parameter intensive. We used some different functional forms. So these were what I showed before, where you had either a linear loss of resources or a non-linear, and that was these that were concave or convex that I showed before. We also looked at if it was binary or flow based, and that was if we took into account only the presence absence of links or also had some measures of their weight. And what we could show here was that the non-linear loss of resources and both binary and flow, but the non-linear was the important thing, that was the ones that best reproduced the results from the ATN model. What this figure shows is on the x-axis the rank, so which model ranked the best, where 1 is the best and 5 is the worst. And we can see that it's the non-linear binary and non-linear flow that is on the first, that is always best ranked. We don't have to care about this now, but this was if the background extinction rates, so the pies for the species, were uniform or trophic level based. I think I skip this and jump here. So we could show that our method, the Bayesian network approach for analyzing secondary extinctions, worked well. We caught most of the extinctions from the ATN model. And there are some positive things with the Bayesian network approach. It is that it does not require simulated extinction with an numerous replicate, which the ATN model does. So it's not as intensive. It also takes into account all possible outcomes without the need to compute them all. And that's what we do with this conditional probability table. And it does capture a majority of the extinctions produced by this by considerably more complex models. On the negative side is that the Bayesian networks can, in this format at least, not account for top-down effects, because we only look at how the resources affect its consumers, so not how the consumers affect their resources. We cannot have feedback loops when we use this Bayesian networks approach. And it can also be a drawback, is that it actually calculates the mean of all possible scenarios. We might be more interested in certain scenarios. Just something to keep in mind. This is a commercial break, but this is we use this Bayesian network approach to look at, to extend it to meta communities. So food webs interacting over space in a recent publication from our lab. And I put this in here, not only for commercial, but to show that we can use this Bayesian network for quite complex food webs. So in this case, we had landscape with 300 patches and communities with about 100 species in them. So quite complex networks. And without going in any details of this, we analyzed how habitat fragmentation affected, or habitat loss affected secondary extinctions in food webs. So you can use this for quite complex food webs and landscapes in this case. But let's go back to this, where we almost started. So ecological networks, and again, they are affected by humans. And this is what we want to come at, how threats goes into the ecological networks, how it's transported within the network, and how it, if it potentially then affects a risk or has a risk at ecosystem service delivery that this network is experienced. So to look at this, we have look at the data set from the Baltic Sea. So this is a picture of the Baltic Sea when it's algal blooming season. And this is not the only problem, unfortunately, that the Baltic Sea is having. The Baltic is, as you probably know, surrounded by a lot of countries, a lot of different countries, and it's also quite small and has a lot of effects from a lot of different countries going into this sea. So we use a completely new data set from the Baltic Sea. This data set is not published yet, but we hope to do it here in the spring, or at least get it flying on the spring, and then we see how long it takes. But this one consists of about 2,500 species and 18,000 interactions, and it's feeding interactions because this is a food web. It interestingly also consists of 32 sub-networks with network sizes ranging from about 200 to 1,700 species. And the species that are included are all from the primary producers, the benthic communities, and the fishes and birds and mammals. The different locations, it's 32 different locations, but it looks something like this. And I didn't include all of them here because we have a lot of more locations here down in the south. But the Baltic is also interesting since it have this salinity gradient where it's really salty out here in Kattegat, but up in the Bothnian Bay here, it's completely sweet water. And in here is a different level of brackish water. And it's also interesting that we know we have different levels of disturbances in these different areas, much often coupled to the populations in different coastal communities here. So for example, along the coast here, there are some types of disturbances that are more severe, and in other parts, there are other disturbances that are more severe. So what kind of data did we have here? Well, we have the species interaction network. We have also threats coupled to each of these species. We have an estimation of the ecosystem service provisioning for each species. And both the threats and services are from HELCOM reports. We wanted to simulate different scenarios in when analyzing this threat network service chain. So we wanted to look at different scenarios of how species respond to loss of their prey. So these different functional forms that we talked about earlier. We wanted to look at different levels of severity of the threat, and also how ecosystem respond to loss of its providers. So how quickly an ecosystem services are lost when its providers are lost. So these different scenarios, when we're varying the response to extinct resources, we use this beta function that we talked about that could vary between this linear and convex and concave functions. The severity of threat we modeled as different levels based on this baseline probability for a species to go extinct when it's affected by a threat. And the specific values chosen here should go between 0 and 1, and we arbitrarily picked 0.1, 0.5, and 1 as low, medium, and high levels of severity of threat. And the last scenario, or part of the scenario, is the ecosystem service delivery loss in response to providers lost. And this you recognize from the resource or the consumer response to resources loss. So here on the x-axis, we have the fraction of ecosystem service providers lost. And on the y-axis, we have the probability of the ecosystem service going lost. So in this first case, we have a quite resilient ecosystem service that have a low probability of going lost until a certain point where it goes much higher. We have the linear case, and in the last third example here, we see that that's an example of where the ecosystem service can get lost, even if have a high probability of going lost, even if quite few of its providers are lost. And that was exactly what I said. So let's go in here. So what did we find in this Baltic Sea food web example? So one of the result figures, or all the results figures we will look at here, looks like this. So on the x-axis, we have the different ecosystem services. So for example, you can see here, we have cultural values, we have erosion control, provisioning of food, primary production, water purification, etc. On the y-axis, we have the fraction of service retained. So important here, it is retained, so it's how much it's actually kept of that service. We only looked here at a sigmoid function of how, or in these figures, I only show one example of how resources or how consumers respond to loss of their resources. But we look at 3 different cases of how to model loss of the ecosystem service. So if it's a convex, a linear, or a concave. So the convex one, that was that one that is a bit more severe, that you don't need so many providers going lost before the ecosystem service get lost. And the concave is the opposite, and the linear is somewhere in between. So the first thing we can see is that this, of course, have a large effect on the results, which we would expect, where the concave response scenario is the most severe and the convex is the least severe. So, but for example, here in this provisioning of food, I just took out so we can focus on one here. There's quite a lot, or it's a large spread, so it has a big effect in how we model this loss, or how affected the ecosystem services is to loss of its providers. And here I took out just one example of threat. So this was changes in salinity regime. We will see we had a number of threats, but for simplicity here, I just picked out one. What we also can see from this figure is that it's quite varying how much of the ecosystem service or the risk of the ecosystem service to get lost, depending on which service we look at. So provisioning of food here is reached quite low levels of probability of being retained, whereas, for example, natural hazard regulation is always intact when the threat is changes in salinity regime. So different responses to different ecosystem services. Here is some more or some different threats. Here's what we looked at before. So this is changes in salinity regime. This is input of organic matter, selective extraction of species, and siltation and seabed damage. So these are 4 different threats. And I wanted to put this up just to show you that it varies quite differently depending on what threat we are putting. And this of course depends on which species that are affected by the threat, and in turn, which species, how they are connected, and then how they are affecting the ecosystem service delivery. So just to point out a few things here, this is provisioning of food, that ecosystem services I point out here. And depending on the threat, we have a different level of severity. So changes in salinity regime and selective extraction of species is quite bad compared to inputs of organic matter that is not affecting this ecosystem service as much. Yeah, and I should also say that because I said we had these 32 different sub-regions, the results I'm showing here is for an average for all these regions together. So we looked at the full meta web of the Baltic Sea in this case. Here, on the other hand, is 2 different locations. So I just took out 2 of these locations here. It's Gulf of Riga and Rugia Lagoons. And if we focus here on one specific ecosystem service, so here I shows nutrient recycling. It's the same threat in both of these sub networks. So it's again changes in salinity regime. But the effect of changes in salinity regime is higher on nutrient recycling in the Gulf of Riga compared to the Rugia Lagoons. And this is also true for some other of the services here. So, but what we can see is that it is different depending on which subnetwork we look at. So to summarize these results, we can analyze the effects of extinctions in very large and complex food webs using this Bayesian network approach. Our framework is quite flexible for how to couple threats to species and how to model ecosystem service loss via the species interaction network. The food web interactions can have large effect on the level of ecosystem service provisioning. And we can also see that effects varies depending on the network structure. For example, and here this is exemplified by the spatial location where the networks look different depending on which species are there and how they interact. But we can also see that the amount of the effect is highly dependent on how we model the losses, of course. So therefore, what I've not shown you here and what we're working on now is to refine the functions, because how do we actually, what is the reasonable way to model severity of certain threats and response shape? And now we modeled all different response shapes for all different services, but that's probably not true, and we could refine these based on our knowledge, probably. One can also imagine that we actually have network of threats, and that is what I drawn here, that there are some threats that actually catalyze effects of other threats, and as such forms a different network. We can also imagine that we have networks of ecosystem services, that one service is affecting another, and that also forms a network. And we can include socioeconomic networks as a layer in this. And this is just to show those extensions in a different way, that we have ecological networks that are affected by conservation efforts we are doing. The ecological network is affected by the socioeconomic network. The service network so that is the ecosystem service network, is affected by how the ecological network looked and how the socioeconomic network looked and which conservation strategies. And also lastly here, the threat network are also affecting the service network. So we can see this as we can extend it to a multi-layer network to include these different aspects, which would be doable in the Bayesian network framework. And this figure is taken from a paper that was recently published in Philosophical Transactions. So by that, I want to thank the lab and my collaborators. So Giri Barbas, Alisa Sertwil, and Ute Jakob, they are a collaborator on this project. Stefano Alesina at University of Chicago and Si Tang at Lei University, who I wrote the first secondary extinction and Bayesian network approach paper with. And the lab today is Johanna Åkesson, Jonathan Orvan, and Mikael Olsson, and some funders, and of course, you for listening. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you, Anna. That was a really interesting talk. I'm just going to get straight to the questions. So